Hi, I'm Marco. I'm a principal software engineer at Equal Experts, and today I'm going to be talking to you about a blog series that I wrote called Madness to Method, where I show you a methodical approach to using AI in the software development lifecycle. In today's installment, we're going to be looking at guardrails, and more particularly, we'll look at rules files that you can use when you're using AI for software development. So let's jump right into it. But before we get started with the actual creation or crafting of rules, let's take a quick look at what we're trying to achieve. Now, I want to introduce you a concept called the progressive precision refinement process. Now, when we use this process, we're aiming at trying to get as far as possible using a prompt as we can. Now, it's very similar to golf in a way, where you tee off from a platform and you try and get as close to the green as possible, and all you have to do is do a few putts to get the ball in. But when we're using something like vibe coding, which is very common these days, people just opening a chat window and putting their way through to the green, you can imagine that's a very inefficient method or way of doing it. Nobody tees off with a putter and works their way to the green that way. That's highly inefficient. So why do we think doing this when we're coding is any better? So let's rather focus on getting a solid tee off, trying to get our ball as close to the green as possible. To do that, we need to know where the rough is. Now that's where rules come in. Rules give you those guardrails to stay on track and allow you to get as close to the green as possible. Of course, we'll look at effective prompting later in the series, but for now, let's just understand where the rough is. That's what this is about, to establish those borders of where we can and can't go. Now that we understand this process, let's take a look at what goes into making a good rule. So no surprises here. We're going to be using the same technique that we used in the last installment, which is meta prompting. So I've already done this hard work for you. I've spent time with an LLM establishing a template for a rule that is well formed, a rule that will be easy to interpret by an LLM, in fact optimized to be consumed by an LLM. I'll be sharing that with you at the end of this. Having this template in place, you can now go ahead and you can meta prompt, referencing the template to generate a rule. So how does that look? You'll simply say, please generate me a rule that describes the principles of domain-driven design by Eric Evans using this template. The LLM now goes away and it generates a well-formed rule for you. And that rule you can now go and use whenever you're prompting an LLM to generate code. Having such rules in place will guide the LLM to stay on track when you're generating code. Remember that LLMs can't read your mind, and the code that it's been trained on takes many shapes and forms. So all your preferences, all the things that you value, all the things that make your code your own are things that need to be captured in rules to ensure that the code that is generated looks like your own. Okay, so let's take a closer look at what this rules template actually looks like before we start using it. So firstly, you'll see it's got a clear title. Then it's got hints for the LLM on what to do for every single section of the generated rule. So for instance, a little bit of preamble, brief description of the rules domain and its scope. What aspect of development, architecture, or methodology do these rules govern? Keep this concise and focused on the purpose and boundaries of these rules. Next, it's got a section of contextual information. It captures the core principles for that rule. Then it's got a very interesting section that describe 3 levels of rules: critical, important, and preferred. And it breaks the rules up according to must have, should have, and could have. Then it's got a section that describes patterns and anti-patterns, normally expressed in snippets of code if relevant. It has a decision framework of how to resolve the rules, a section for exceptions and waivers, some quality gates, even some related rules to this one. Finally, it's got a section of references, links out to the internet. And best of all, it's got a TLDR section at the end, which summarizes what that rule is about. This is for when you've exceeded your context window and the LLM just looks for a quick summary of what your rule is about. Okay, armed with our template file, we're now ready to go and generate our rule. So we'll be using a meta prompt to do that, applying the template to whatever topic we're interested in. In this case, as keeping with our example, we're going to use Eric Evans's book, Domain-Driven Design, as the source of the rule to be generated. So I've prepared a little meta prompt. Let's take a look. So I've said, please generate me a rule based on the principles of domain-driven design as described in Eric Evans's book of the same title. The rules file should be based on the attached template file called 00rulestemplate.md. Generate the rules file as markdown and place it in the rules directory with a name similar to the other rules. And as you can see, I've attached the directory where to write and the template. Let's run that and see what happens. Right, so after a minute or two, we're done generating, and here's the final result. As you can see, a clear title that says Domain-Driven Design, or DDD. Little preamble here says Guidelines for Implementing Domain-Driven Design Principles to Tackle Complexity in Software Systems by focusing the design on the core business domain and domain logic. Based on Eric Evans's foundational work on creating software that reflects deep understanding of business domains. As you can see, there's a bit of upfront context. The core principles like ubiquitous language, domain focus, model-driven design, bounded context, and continuous learning. It's broken it down into the 3 tiers of rules that we care about for critical, important, and preferred. It's even generated some bits of code of good practices or bad practices. I might consider just ditching that because it's probably not that important. Decision framework, when rules conflict, some scenarios, otherwise when facing edge cases, an exception waiver section as we had in our template, some quality gates, related rules. As you can see, it's mentioned the ones that actually are relevant, some references to the web of where this is actually detailed, and I see it's even included Vermeulen's book, which is also an authoritative text in the field, and as always a TLDR section which just summarizes the crux of the rule. We now have the foundational concepts under our belt, namely meta prompting and guardrails. In the next installment, we're going to get into some real action, and we're going to look at the driving shot prompt, where we start writing a feature from scratch using a methodical approach.